Um, Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening for the ones that will be listening and watching our discussion on a later date. My name is Artur Skorga. I'm a scholar from the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. I'm an executive secretary of the European Association of Israel Studies. And the association, it launched a series of interviews and discussions with important scholars dealing with the Israel studies field. It was a few months back, and now we are having the fifth part of the series of interviews. And in most cases, these interviews are based on the most recent book of the guest scholar. And this is the case also today with the newest book of Dr. Amnon Aran. Dr. Amnon Aran is a senior lecturer at the City University of London. He was also previously a fellow in international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And he's a renowned scholar dealing with Middle Eastern studies, international relations in the Middle East, also into more theoretical field of international relations, concentrating on the foreign policy analysis. But outside of the scholarly work, he's also an active actor in the public debate on the Middle Eastern affairs in media. He also contributed to many policy-making forums in Britain and in Europe. And that is why I'm really thrilled that we are hosting Dr. Aran today virtually at the European Association of Israel Studies. I'm looking forward to the discussion in the following minutes. So Dr. Aran, really thank you that you accepted our invitation. I'm really grateful that you are here with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for organizing the interview. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Great. As I said, the discussion here will be mostly about your most recent book, The Foreign Policy of Israel After the End of the Cold War. It's a very new book, and I enjoyed the lecture immensely. I think it's an important contribution to the Israeli studies, and it merges your two interests, the Middle Eastern affairs and this theoretical field of the foreign policy analysis. And I would say that it's important both because it can be treated as a handbook to the students of Middle Eastern affairs, the PhD students, because it provides the chronology, the periodization, it explains the dynamics of the foreign policy of Israel. But at the same time, it is a research work per se. You employ the analytical framework to deal with the case study. You provide a fresh new perspective of the relations of Israel and its partners. And the book concentrates mainly on the Arab-Israeli relations. Well, it's basically about the foreign policy, but the core of this foreign policy is the relations with the Arab states. And I would like to start with the questions about this topic. And let's take a step back and make an overlook over the conflict and ask about the reasons for the hostilities. And I would like to come back to the quotation from the president of Egypt, Anwar al-Sadat, who speaking before Knesset in 1977, he said that the 70% of the problem with the Middle Eastern conflict is a psychological one, is the barrier of suspicion. So when you were analyzing these last 3 decades of the numerous rounds of negotiations of Israelis, Syrians, Palestinians, Jordanians, did you see similar thing? Do you think that the psychological barriers are the main reason for the conflict, or is it more about the more material factors at play, the conflicting interests as land, water?
Well, thank you. I think the psychological factors certainly played an important role. And I think an interesting contrast, of course, is the difference between, for example, the very warm negotiations and quick signing of agreement between Israel and Jordan, which of course built on many years of covert meetings and relations, especially between leaders like Yitzhak Rabin and the late King Hussein. And that was reflected very well in the speed of the negotiations, in the final signing of the agreement, and the warmth that at least surrounded initially the peace agreement, in contrast to the negotiations with Syria that, that never really picked off and were really beset by psychological factors that influenced both sides from the period of Rabin, but also through other Israeli prime ministers, including Ehud Barak, and perhaps to a lesser extent, Benjamin Netanyahu. At the same time, though, I think that material aspects are significant, but certainly when it comes to the Palestinians, there are more deeper issues, the historical issues, the religious issues, of course, the developments on the ground, such as the settlement project, and the influence that came from both sides of groups that were opposing the peace process. And I think the Palestinian arena is a good example, which also includes the negotiations with Syria, of how domestic factors, domestic groups who were opposing the peace agreements were also very influential. So going back to your quote from Sadat, I think the psychological factors were certainly a very significant one, but they are inseparable from also the deeper issues in the Palestinian arena, and also the influence of domestic groups, which of course are inextricably linked to material factors as well. So it is a combination, and I think you cannot really separate between these various factors.
And you've mentioned the domestic factors, and the framework, the theoretical framework that you employ deals with the domestic factors being the filters to the external stimuli, with the domestic factors being the decision makers, the security network and narratives that they employ, that they believe in. Looking at nowadays foreign policy of Israel, how would you balance the relation between the external stimuli and the domestic factors? Are the filters strong enough to withstand the pressure from the international system? For example, could you imagine the US policy or EU foreign policies pressuring Israel to changing significantly its foreign policies, or these filters are strong enough to withstand this pressure?
So I think the way these filters work is not only about withstanding or not, but about interpreting what international actors are doing and what is the significance for Israel. And you can take two contrasting examples, which are directly connected to the relationship with the United States. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was a strong believer in the relationship with the United States, but very importantly, he really believed that this was the key for Israel's survival in the region, and that Israel could not have reached the point it had without strong support from the United States. And therefore, a staple of Rabin's policy was always to have very good and strong relations with the US, and to have very amicable relationships with the current administration. Interestingly, Ariel Sharon, who of course came to power later, learned from his own experience what it meant to be in attention with the US administration. And when he came to power, again, adopted an approach of coordination and a very strong alliance and alignment with the United States. And you can contrast that with the actions of prime ministers like Yitzhak Shamir, who really went to the brink with the United States, famously. This is just one example of how, when you have different prime ministers, and I think it's important at least to note that in my book, I really identified prime ministers as the most important factor in shaping the relationship, and how different prime ministers really produce different relations, in this case with the United States. But of course, you can go and see that throughout the spectrum of Israel's foreign policies. The Palestinians is another good example, and the contrast between prime ministers like Shamir and Netanyahu on the one hand, or prime ministers like Ehud Olmert, Ehud Barak, and Yitzhak Rabin on the other hand. The Palestinians are still the Palestinians, but different Israeli leaders see their actions, interpret them in a very different way. And so does the security network too.
Yeah, right. And you wrote about the periodization of the foreign policy of Israel, and you stick to the prime minister. So you started with the entrenchment policy of Yitzhak Shamir. Then we have the engagement, the honeymoon of hope, the Oslo Accords, and Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. But let's start from the entrenchment. So I would say the policy that is embedded in the writings of the revisionist Zionists from the interwar period, and this iron wall against the Arabs policy. So you have to, Israel have to hit him, has to hit them hard, so they learn that Israel is here to stay in the Middle East. So this policy of entrenchment of Israel must survive by the sword. Do you think that it was successful when you look, for example, at the Egyptian-Israeli accords, or maybe the wave of normalizations of the recent months with the Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Sudan, or Morocco signing accords with Israel? Well, there is a big question also of the Saudi Arabia and maybe future decision on the normalization. Do you think that the reason for this change is the policy of entrenchment, the hardline policies of the right-wing government?
So I think it's a very good question, and I think the two cases that you mentioned are different. So I think Egypt, of course, the agreement with Egypt launched what I called in the book Israel's foreign policy of engagement. And what that means is that Israel is willing to make peace in return and return land to an Arab state, so effectively a land for peace formula. It then, of course, changes the premium of relations from a military engagement to diplomacy. And in the case of the Palestinians, of course, but even in the discussions with Egypt, there is an intention to roll back at least the Israeli occupation. And even in the negotiations with Egypt, in the Camp David Accords, there was an issue of Palestinian autonomy that was included, but was never fulfilled. And of course, the relationship and the peace accord with Egypt then became the template for future negotiations with Syria, with the Palestinians, and to a far lesser extent with Jordan, because the issue of land was basically non-existent there. So when we look at this foreign policy, we see actually a very strong success in the case of Egypt. When the agreement was signed, there was some skeptical on both sides whether it will withstand. And here we are in 2021 with Israel and Egypt doing something that probably the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser would never believe could have happened. Israel and Egypt imposing a siege on the Gaza Strip where the Palestinians are. So this is really a seismic shift in the international politics of the Middle East. Now, when we move to entrenchment, I think certainly the recent agreements that were signed, the Abraham Accords and the subsequent agreements with Morocco and Sudan, show the potential of entrenchment. And that means that Israel basically signs peace for peace, not land for peace. It still keeps the option of the iron wall, that means the iron wall of military strength, intact. And the Palestinians remain under occupation. Their situation doesn't change. And of course, on one level, Mr. Netanyahu showed that this foreign policy approach does have potential as long as you have a strong American backer that can provide various Arab states with the things that they need from a peace agreement, even though it doesn't relate to Israel directly. The question, of course, that arises is whether this foreign policy of entrenchment is sustainable in the long run. And this is, I think, is the big question. Sustainable on two levels. First of all, will the Arab and Israeli elites that signed the agreement remain in power? That still is yet to be seen. And because these agreements do not have yet the popular support in the broader Arab world in the same degree that they have in the elites, that's, of course, an important question. And the second level is whether Israel's occupation of the Palestinians, again, in the longer run, at the moment in the West Bank, is sustainable. And those are two big question marks that still hover above Israel's entrenchment foreign policy position.
Okay, right. Let me continue with the second issue. So the Palestinian question, the Palestinian occupation, you write about the peace offer of Ehud Olmert to Abu Mazen, to Mahmoud Abbas in 2008, and probably it was the last of the serious peace proposals from the Israeli side to the Palestinians, and Abu Mazen didn't hold to it. And you write about the corruption case against Ehud Olmert, that was the reason for it. But wouldn't you think that maybe it was more wise for the Abu Mazen policy to accept this offer, even if Ehud Olmert is out of power or is out of politics because of his corruption case? Well, we have the public offer from the Israeli side accepted, with reneging of the Israeli side on the control of Holy Basin, all the border presence in the Jordan Valley. So it's a good starting point for the Palestinians for the future negotiations with the other prime ministers of Israel. Was it a good opportunity for the Palestinians that was lost, or not really?
I think that's a very good question, and I think one could extend that question also to the decision beforehand by Yasser Arafat to reject or not to really pursue very forcefully the Clinton parameters. So I think the question is relevant for both cases. And I think the question is also related to a much deeper question about whether there is a Palestinian partner for peace or not. And my view is that, in fact, one can very much understand why the Palestinians rejected both proposals at the time. The reason being that both proposals were made by very weak Israeli prime ministers, that arguably would have found it very difficult, perhaps even impossible, to actually realize the proposals that they're made. Now, in the situation where Ehud Barak or Ehud Olmert, the two Ehuds, are unable to realize their proposals, and the Palestinians agree to the proposals, where does that leave the Palestinians? It leaves them, in this case, Abu Mazen, previously Arafat, renouncing their historical claim to Jerusalem, renouncing their historical claim to the return of the refugees, without really getting anything in return. Now, of course, in hindsight, we know how things developed, and it may well be that both Arafat and Abu Mazen made a mistake in not accepting the offers. We will never know. History never gives its alternatives. But I think if we try to put ourselves in their place at that political moment, it is understandable why they themselves could not see themselves sign on the dotted line, because the option of actually the Israeli prime minister implementing the offer was very, very questionable. So they would have found themselves in a situation where they had effectively renounced or given up or relinquished historical rights only to get nothing in return. And I think that was the line of thinking that guided Arafat. That was the line of thinking that guided Abu Mazen. It may have been a wrong decision, but I think that concluding from that there is no Palestinian partner is wrong and also superficial.
Okay, right. And let me get back to this main thread of your book, this periodization of the entrenchment, engagement, and unilateralism foreign policies of Israel. You've talked about the entrenchment. Engagement would be the Palestinian-Israeli peace process of the 90s, then the unilateral policies of Kadima. But we have 12 years of the long premiership of Benjamin Netanyahu now. Actually, I think on the 1st of April, that will be the start of the 13th year of Netanyahu, if he's still in power after the elections. And would you say that it's just coming back to the entrenchment, or is the mix of entrenchment and unilateralist policies, or are there any good traits to the foreign policy? How would you label the foreign policies of Benjamin Netanyahu governments?
So I think Benjamin Netanyahu and his governments, since the first time he came to power in 1996, and certainly since he returned to power in 2009, Netanyahu is almost the quintessential entrencher. He has been an extremely consistent prime minister. He's been a very consistent statesman. various people disagree with his policies, but the continuities in his approach are much greater than the discontinuities. It is true that sometimes Netanyahu deviates on tactical matters. So, for example, in his first prime ministership, he signed the Hebron Agreement. It was really the first time that a Likud government and the Likud was willing to exchange, to some extent, land for peace, or at least sign on giving up parts of the West Bank. But very quickly afterwards, he reneged on his commitments. And of course, we know that in his first time when he returned to power, when he was negotiating with the Obama administration, he delivered his famous Bar Ilan speech, where again, he at least acknowledged the need for a Palestinian state. But then again, when it came to practicalities, even though he imposed a moratorium on settlements, he never really deviated significantly from the contours of entrenchment, meaning only signing peace for peace, keeping the military option as the main option for Israel, and retaining the Palestinians under occupation, subservient to Israel. And we see this very consistently in his premiership. And in fact, when we look at the speeches he delivered throughout the Arab uprisings, and certainly after the signing of the Abraham Accords, Netanyahu repeatedly said that this is his agenda, peace for peace, not peace for territory. And therefore, really, I think Benjamin Netanyahu and before him, Yitzhak Shamir, were the strongest representations of Israel's foreign policy of entrenchment.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at this issue in the light of the Syrian question. 2 days ago, the Saudi newspaper Asharq al-Awsat wrote about the peace offer that was prepared by Obama presidency for Syria and Israel. They wrote that it was ready for the signature. And 3 years ago, we had Uzi Arad, who told Israeli media about the 2 rounds of negotiations between Netanyahu and Bashar Assad. So the question here is how serious it was. What do we know about the negotiations? Was it just a bluff from the Bibi Netanyahu? And what do you say? What about the future of the Golan Heights? Is the withdrawal from Golan Heights on the table in the foreseeable future coming back, or not really?
So maybe let me take your first question first. I think in light of the brutal Syrian civil war and really the horrific human rights crimes that were committed by the Assad regime, I think for the foreseeable future, if I had to guess, I do not think that we will see an Israeli prime minister considering seriously a return of the Golan Heights. And of course, that is connected also to the change of status that the United States underwent towards the Golan Heights under the Trump administration. So I think those 2 factors have really diminished the chances of the Golan Heights returning as a bargaining chip in negotiations. Never say never, but that would be my assessment for the foreseeable future for sure. More broadly about Netanyahu's approach to negotiations, the details about the recent round are still shrouded in darkness, so it's difficult to say. But what we do have much more details is about Netanyahu's negotiations with Hafez al-Assad during his first prime ministership via the mediation of one Ron Lauder, businessman. And what we know from that episode is when the negotiations reached the crunch point, when Hafez al-Assad requested from Netanyahu a map, at that point Netanyahu backed off, partly because of pressure from his ministers, but looking at the evidence, it would also seem that Netanyahu was trying to buy time to fend off pressure on the Palestinian front. And when he reached the point where really taking the next step would mean entering into serious negotiations with Syria, he decided to stop the negotiations and they were cut short. Observing Netanyahu over the years, I would find it highly unlikely that he would be willing to return the Golan Heights or parts of the Golan Heights to a Syrian regime. judging on his past. And my interpretation, but again, we have very few details, very few sources that we can look at, would be that negotiations with Bashar al-Assad were probably more tactical than strategic and would have reached the same dead end that the negotiations with Hafez al-Assad, the father, reached back in the 1990s.
Okay. I've mentioned the involvement of US in the Middle Eastern affairs, a very strong one, obviously, after the Cold War, the only great power with so immense influence on the affairs. And you've mentioned in your book the Walt Mishheimer thesis about the Israeli lobby. So United States foreign policy being against the interest of Americans, and the reason for it being the activities of the pro-Israeli lobby. And you tend to disagree with this thesis of the American scholars, saying that there are, well, pointing at the moments where the stances of America and Israel were very divergent. And would you say that the presidency of Donald Trump changed something? Do you see the, I don't know if 100, but a great convergence of the stances of US and Israel? And if so, is it about the activity of Israel lobby, or are there other factors at play?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's a very important point. I strongly disagree with Walter Mersheimer, and I don't think that the Trump administration changes this, and I'll try and explain why. My main disagreement with Walter Mersheimer is not about the influence of the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby is an influential lobby, but of course, the American political system, including foreign policy, is built on the influence of different lobbies. So we have the Armenian lobby, we have the Israel lobby, we have the Cuban lobby that was a significant factor in America not renewing diplomatic relations with Cuba for so much time. So there are a lot of lobbies in the United States, and the Israel lobby is one of them. My main disagreement with Walter Mersheimer is that I have not found an example where the Israel lobby has managed to change the course of a foreign policy that was decided by the President of the United States. So the Israel lobby can influence the foreign policy course as long as it is in some alignment with what the president wants to do in the first place. But in those situations where there is a strong divergence between what the president wants to do and what the Israel lobby wants the United States to do, usually the president wins. And there are two clear examples of this. The most recent example is the policy of Barack Obama towards Iran. That was one of the greatest rifts between the United States and Israel, and no amount of pressure from the Israel lobby was able to change the fact that the United States signed an agreement with Israel's greatest enemy in the Middle East, namely Iran. Prior to that, of course, we have the example of George Bush Sr., who went completely against the course of Yitzhak Shamir and his settlement project. And when the two came to a head, George Bush Sr. won, and won in the confrontation surrounding the loans crisis, and indeed was a factor in Yitzhak Shamir losing the election. Going back to Trump, his administration had a very different strategic outlook towards the Middle East than Obama's, which actually aligned with Israel. The Trump administration was close allies with Saudi Arabia, close allies with Israel, and effectively departed from Obama's stance. Trump, in contrast to Obama, went back to the US's traditional allies in the Middle East, Israel and Saudi Arabia especially. Egypt, of course, was included in that, and was willing to support them to the hilt in their dealings with Iran. That was the starting point of the Trump administration. And of course, on top of that, that suited Trump's domestic agenda, his close ties with the evangelical Christians and other Israel supporters in the United States. So in other words, the Israel lobby did not have to work very hard to get Trump's support. There was an alignment between the domestic agenda of the Trump administration, the external outlook into the Middle East, and of course that resulted in what many did not expect, namely the Abraham Accords and the subsequent accords between Israel and Sudan and Israel and Morocco. So my disagreement with Walter Mersheimer's stand, I have yet to find an example where the United States wanted to go in one direction and the Israel lobby was able to divert it and go to another direction. And frankly, to end this point, the claims made by Mersheimer and Walt that somehow the Israelis were the ones that pushed for the war in Iraq are completely unfounded. The Americans decided on the war beforehand, and as one Israeli minister told me in an interview, Israel was not going to dissuade the United States from attacking Saddam Hussein, but it certainly was not the one that pushed for it in the first place.
Continuing with the American-Israeli relations, at the same time you wrote that the relations are not eternal and forever, and probably it might be surprising for the ones who are seeing the half of century of closer and closer relations and cooperation between the two states. But do you see any manifestations of the coming change in the relations? Do you see the alliance, the informal but close alliance disentanglement in the near future? Do you think that Joe Biden make any change in the relations between Israel and America? Maybe not in comparison with Donald Trump's policies, because it would be easier, but comparing the policy of Biden and Clinton or Bush.
So what I see are some cracks. And I think it is very much dependent or up to the politicians on both sides and the leaders, especially in the case of Israel, the future prime minister, and in the case of the United States, the current president, Joe Biden, and his administration. It's very much up to them to decide what they're going to do about these cracks. The main crack that I see, of course, relates to Israel's relations with the Democratic Party. It started under the Obama administration. The confrontation by Benjamin Netanyahu around the Iranian issue was unprecedented in US-Israeli relations, certainly since the strategic alliance was set in stone. Perhaps not unprecedented, but very, very forceful, very, very forceful indeed, certainly on top and in line with Yitzhak Shamir's stance on the settlement, to take another example, or Menachem Begin's decision to annex the Golan Heights. And of course, the United States and Israel were able to mend the fences and carry on. But one crack, I think, is that political rift between the Israeli government and the Democratic Party. And another one, of course, concerns the growing gulf between the liberal camp in the United States and the Israeli continued occupation of the West Bank and the Palestinians. This has been a point that has been a divergent point between liberals, but also between parts of the Jewish community in the United States and Israel. Certainly, if you look at the current generations of young Americans, again, liberal Americans, they would feel less generations. And that, I think, is probably the largest crack that I can identify. The other question, of course, is strategic. Israel has been very skillful in demonstrating its strategic value during the Cold War. And also after the Cold War, certainly in the first decade, Israel was a real partner to the American plan of making peace with the Arab world and delinking the Arab countries from Iran, perhaps with the exception of Netanyahu's first prime ministership. And of course, in the next decade, Israel was an integral partner of what was described as the war on terror. It is interesting to see that, of course, American interests in the Middle East have weakened to a point. That is another question mark that is hovering around the strategic value Israel has for the United States. So I think the combination of certain cracks that are existing in what has been described as the common values between Israel and the United States, at least the liberal segments of the United States, and some question marks surrounding the strategic value that Israel has for the US, do raise these questions about the strength of the US-Israeli alliance. At the same time, of course, we have seen a very strong alliance and also alliance in values between the Trump administration, but more importantly, the groups that support Trump and the Israeli right. So I think, you know, it will be very, very interesting to see how the trajectory develops over the next few years. And that will, of course, depend also on who wins the Israeli elections coming up in March.
Yeah, probably we will also come back to the elections in a few minutes, but I would like to ask you about the other issue now. You study a book from the Polish Solidarity movement, and let me take it as a pretext to ask you the question about my country and the region of Central Eastern Europe and its relations with Israel. And we could have seen the thaw in relations of Israel and this region after the end of the Cold War. And I would say that in the last 2 decades, the relations are getting even warmer, though we see the reappearing of the tensions, mostly about the historical issues and something that it's called in Poland, the historic policy of the state. So what are your vision of the future, the prospects of the relations between Israel and the Central Eastern Europe?
I mean, I think the trajectory that it's very difficult to talk about the future. I think it also depends partly on the future of the European project, which is a bigger question as well. I think, interestingly, what has been very fascinating to see is the contrast between some of the Central and Eastern European countries' relations with Israel. Like you say, the growing convergence, not without tensions, of course, but general rapprochement, if you like, following the end of the Cold War. And contrast that with some of the tensions that existed with Western European countries, for example, like France and Ireland. And I think, of course, the history plays here 2 parts. There is one part that creates tensions between the countries, but it also is an area which brings the countries together in a way to sort of try and rebuild on the troubled past something better. But I think also generally, you know, we have seen a much stronger but a closer relationship. And I think the main trend that I would point to is, again, this contrast between the much more amicable relations. And indeed, it's interesting that with the end of the Cold War, the first countries that actually sought to re-establish diplomatic relations from the former Soviet bloc were these Central and Eastern European countries, which were very quick in trying to rekindle diplomatic relations with Israel. And it seems to me that part of the points of friction that exist between Israel and some Western European countries, again, like France, like Ireland, some parts of Spain, especially in the left, are not as pronounced in the Central European and Eastern European countries. And I think it's been a very interesting diplomatic relationship to observe since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. Right. And when we think about the Israel-European relation, you've mentioned that the important question here is the future of the European Union. How would you describe the effect of, for example, the demise of the European Union on Israel? Would it be something that the Israelis would be happy about? Can it be something good for the Israel foreign policy to have to deal with the states and not the European Union as an organization?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think, again, you know, we can't really look forward and see whether the European project is in demise or not. But what is interesting is that Israel has had a very consistent foreign policy towards the European, well, first it was, of course, the European Economic Community, which then expanded and became into what we know today as the European Union. There's been a very interesting divergence between the very clear trajectory of growing and deepening economic relations, which accelerated, of course, after the end of the Cold War, because Israel was able to leverage the peace process, not even peace agreements, but the very fact that Israel had a peace process with the Arab world was leveraged very skillfully by Israeli prime ministers to upgrade and change the trade relations and the trade agreements, importantly, that it had with Europe. And if we look, in hindsight, on the period from 1990, especially from 1995 up until now, we see a very clear trajectory of, as I said, expanding and deepening economic, scientific, and even social relations between Israel and the EU as a bloc. And this is partly also because when it comes to Israel, and this goes back to your previous question, the EU is never unified in its position. There are some countries that are more critical of Israel. Other countries, you mentioned Central and Eastern European countries, and of course Germany as well, has been historically quite supportive of Israel. So when it comes to a policy towards Israel, usually there's a compromise between the countries that support, the countries that oppose. And if there's criticism, it's usually rhetorical. There isn't, the EU has never really taken any firm action. And in the economic level, relationships have gone from strength to strength. If you look at the volume of exports, imports, exchanges, and so on. This is contrasted by the image, at least, that exists in Israel, partly, of the EU being a hostile entity to Israel, which actually is not substantiated if you look at the record. And there is also, of course, a strong and influential part of the Israeli elite, economic elite, but also intellectuals, universities, scientists that are very committed to a strong and close relationship with Europe. So I think Israel has actually managed to benefit quite a bit from managing its relations with Europe carefully and very skillfully leveraging any progress in peace to making progress with Europe as well. Since, of course, the recent development, the eruption of the Arab uprisings, the horrors that we have seen in Yemen, in Syria, and of course, more recently, the pandemic, the European magnifying glass on Israel has been shifted to other places. So at the moment, I think Israeli foreign policy makers are less concerned with Europe than, let's say, some of the Likud prime ministers were during the 90s and the 2000s. And I think this parallel path of some political tensions alongside a clear scientific, economic, and social deepening and expanding of relations is what we're likely to see.
Let me come back to Benjamin Netanyahu, and we all know the success propaganda, Mr. Security, the economic development for the last decade, now the successes with the vaccination campaign. And you, on the other hand, write about the Napoleon Bonaparte's comparison to Netanyahu, and you wrote about this calamitous Russian campaign of Napoleon Bonaparte that was preceded by the triumphs. Do you see these manifestations of the future collapse of the foreign policy of Israel under Netanyahu now?
So I think I do draw some parallels, obviously, and I think that what we need to understand about Mr. Netanyahu's policies, that of course, alongside the achievements that he has, and this is the parallel perhaps to Napoleon. I mean, when Napoleon charged into Europe, it seemed that he was going from strength to strength, from victory to victory, only to find himself bogged down in the Russian winter, which is of course a very dystopian image. So alongside Netanyahu's success, I think there are some very significant vulnerabilities that have not been registered, of course, by the prime minister, but also by his critics in Israel. The first, of course, is the question of the Palestinians. Israel is still an occupying power, and very importantly, any further occupation of the Palestinians poses an existential threat to Israel existing as a democracy and as a Jewish state. And this is an unescapable truth. It can be pushed to the margins, it can be denied, but it is a fact. There are millions of Palestinians who don't have rights, who are in the West Bank. There is, of course, the question of the Gaza Strip as well, and Palestinian Israelis. And Mr. Netanyahu's policies do not address this fundamental political and human issue. That is one vulnerability and one deep problem with Mr. Netanyahu's policies. The other problem, of course, is actually a policy that Mr. Netanyahu likes to boast about, his foreign policy towards Iran. But if we look more closely again, under Mr. Netanyahu's watch, Iran has come more closer to Israel. It has established a firm presence in Syria, although the Israelis are attacking Iranian targets from time to time, but the trajectory is about an Iranian presence in Syria, not an Iranian retreat. And of course, Russia is ever more present on the Israeli doorstep than it has been since the end of the Cold War. If you add to that what we talked about before, the potential cracks with the United States, then one can only conclude that Israel's foreign policy does have major vulnerabilities. And if they are not attended to, if they are not addressed, these vulnerabilities pose major threat to Israel. And this is not only something that I argue. If we look at the statements made by the key Israeli security chiefs in the last decades, people like former Defense Minister Ehud Barak, former Prime Minister and Chief of Staff, of course, the late head of Mossad, Mr. Meir Dagan, the head or former head of the Israeli Shin Bet, Yuval Diskin. The list is very long. They have all identified the same vulnerabilities that I have and expressed it very vocally with regards to Mr. Netanyahu's policy. So Mr. Netanyahu, I think, is projecting an image of unparalleled strength, unparalleled success. But the truth of the matter is that the foundations of Israeli foreign policy are less strong than he presents them to be.
Okay, and in this said light, please let me ask you the last questions about the future of the, well, once again, the question about the future, so not an easy one, about the future of the Middle Eastern peace process. And we've seen the political change in the US. We have in 3 weeks elections coming in Israel. Perhaps we will have elections also on the Palestinian territories. Do you see it more as more challenges and threats, or there is an opportunity for the peace negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis?
I think we're at the moment actually at a major point of the future being very unclear, but even more than that, the present being a bit unclear. I think what will be very interesting to look and to look out for in the future Palestinian elections to start with is actually which segment of Palestinian politics will make gains and which will make which will actually incur losses. We haven't had a Palestinian election since 2006. And these upcoming elections, which one hopes and can assume which will be free and fair elections as the 2006 were, will provide us a very strong reflection of Palestinian society and politics. And I think we need to wait and see what will be the result. First of all, to try and see how political processes, social processes that have been taking place in Palestinian politics, society, and economics, and of course the international standing of Palestinians in the last decades will reflect themselves in the results. When we look at Israel, of course, what is very striking is that the Palestinian issue is not on the agenda in the current elections. It's simply not there. You will not find one party, maybe with the exception of Meretz, the left-wing liberal Zionist party, and maybe what is left from the Labour Party under Merav Michaeli's leadership. They sometimes allude to the Palestinians. But if we compare the central part that relations with the Palestinians and the Arab Middle East played in Israeli elections continuously since the end of the Cold War, and how marginal they are now, that is a very striking shift. And I think they tell us quite a bit on how increasingly less significant, at least for the Israeli electorate, the question of the Palestinian has become. And in that sense, of course, that doesn't bode very well for any type of future negotiations. Having said that, going back to your previous point, this I think is short-sighted. The Palestinians are still firmly rooted in the land, in Israel, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and the question of what relationship do Israelis want and can have with the Palestinians is a question that won't disappear. I tell many people, Israel is already de facto a binational state. It comprises Jews and Palestinians. Some of them have citizenship, others are under occupation. The big question for Israelis for the future is how they wish to manage their relationship with the Palestinians. Will it remain a binational state which will become deeper and more difficult to disentangle, or whether they want to go back and pursue a different path? I think these questions will still remain in the air, and I'm not sure we'll get the answer in the next elections, but maybe they'll give us a bit of a hint about where things are going to.
Yeah, thank you. And I will take it as an element of optimism for the future. I was afraid that your answer will be more pessimistic without any hope, but if it's not clear, there is hope. And there is never...
No, yeah. I'm not sure it's an optimistic outlook. I just think it's a very uncertain one. And it goes back to one of the central arguments that I make in the book, which is that I'm a firm believer that individual leaders have the capacity to significantly shape history. And I think, you know, the future trajectory of Israel in the Middle East will really depend on what its leaders will do. What is common about all Israeli prime ministers, perhaps with the exception of Ehud Olmert since the end of the Cold War, is that all of them have left a mark on Israeli foreign policy. You know, Yitzhak Shamir went to the Madrid Peace Conference. Yitzhak Rabin, we all know his legacy. Ehud Barak, although he failed with his attempts towards Syria and the Palestinians, was responsible for withdrawing Israel from Lebanon. Ariel Sharon withdrew Israel from the Gaza Strip and defeated the Second Palestinian Intifada. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu has under his cap 4 peace agreements. So we always need to remember that Israeli prime ministers will have a dramatic influence on the history and the fate of the Israeli people. And that's why my outlook is uncertain, and it will very much depend on what actions these prime ministers will take. They can take actions that will significantly worsen Israel's position and the Palestinians with them, or they can continue on a path that might improve them. At the moment, I think it is very uncertain how things will develop.
And do you see a politician on the political scene in Israel that can be this leader that will make a good change as a prime minister of Israel nowadays?
Well, I think it very much depends on what we define as a good change. You know, Benjamin Netanyahu would argue that he's made a fantastic change to Israel. He signed 4 agreements, it's a powerful economy, it is dealt relatively well with the coronavirus. So he would argue that he actually made a significant change in at least parts of the world accepting this idea of entrenchment, that Israel should make peace in return for peace, not territory. So we have to be fair and to say that many of Netanyahu's supporters will say that he enacted very positive change. I think his critics, and I think in that sense I would join those critics, would point to the moral decline of Israel under Netanyahu. The moral decline that he has precipitated in deepening the occupation of the Palestinians, of effectively removing the Palestinian process and the idea of a Palestinian state from the agenda. But of course, also, one cannot escape the fact that we have an Israeli prime minister who is effectively on trial and is still running, like you said, to continue and break the record of acting and presiding over the country as its prime minister. And it is, to some extent, has to be recognized as a point of a malaise that the longest standing Israeli prime minister is also the only prime minister that is in the job while on trial. And I think these moral questions to Israel, a country that always aspired to be, in the words of Israel's first Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, a light unto the nations, is a very interesting paradox.
Yeah, there is never enough time for discussions about the Middle East, and we've come to the end of this interview. And for those who feel that they haven't had enough of analysis of Dr. Aran, I very much recommend his most recent book, The Foreign Policy of Israel Since the End of the Cold War. And for sure, it will be the book for my students learning about the Middle Eastern affairs. So I hope everybody enjoyed conversation with Dr. Aran as much as I did. Dr. Aran, thank you greatly for the interesting discussion that we had, for all the insightful assessments of yours. Maybe we will meet in the future on the occasion of some other publication of yours that we are looking forward to. Thank you very much. It was a privilege and honor.
Thank you very much, Artur. It was entirely my pleasure. Thank you very much for your fascinating questions, and I look forward to meeting you in the flesh in the not too distant future.
Thank you very much. And the last issue that I'm addressing to our audience, our subscribers, listeners, and watchers, we have other interesting interviews coming. I know about at least one book that we'll be discussing in the following weeks. So as they said on radio earlier, stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.